Man buys rusty toolbox for $5, then opens it, and can't believe what he finds. The rain pounded against the tin roof of Carter's auto repair like an endless drumroll announcing the shop's impending doom. Daniel Carter stood in the center of the garage, surrounded by the ghosts of his father's dream, tools hanging in perfect order on pegboards, the familiar scent of motor oil and rust that had permeated his childhood, and the overwhelming silence that had settled in since customers had stopped coming. At 43, Daniel's weathered hands and the permanent grease stains under his fingernails told the story of a life dedicated to fixing things. But some things, it seemed, were beyond repair. Final notice. The red stamp declared across the utility bill he held. He'd been juggling them for months now. Pay the electricity and short the bank loan, cover the property tax and let the phone bill slide. The mathematical gymnastics of keeping his father's legacy afloat had become unsustainable. 3 generations of Carters had made their living in this corner of Millfield, Ohio, but it seemed the line would end with him. Daniel folded the notice and tucked it into the back pocket of his faded jeans. The shop phone rang, its shrill tone echoing through the empty garage. "Carter's Auto," he answered, voice gruff from disuse. "Danny boy," came the familiar drawl of Pete Simmons, one of the few friends he had left in Millfield. "You still got your head under a hood or are you free to grab a beer?" Daniel glanced at the clock, 4:37 p.m. on a Tuesday, and not a single car had come in for service. "Actually, I was about to close up," he admitted. "But I'm not sure I've got beer money this month." Pete chuckled, but there was concern behind it. "Well, that's why I called. There's an estate auction happening over at the old Mercer place. Lot of tools and garage equipment. People are mostly after the furniture and kitchenware, so the good stuff might go cheap. Thought you might want to check it out." Daniel's ears perked up. "The Mercer place? Herbert Mercer, the old handyman? That's the one. His daughter's selling everything off before listing the house. Starts in an hour." Hope flickered dimly in Daniel's chest, not the robust kind that changes lives, but the desperate kind that buys a little more time. "I'll be there," he said. The Mercer house sat on 3 acres at the edge of town, a modest farmhouse with a large detached workshop where Herbert had spent most of his life repairing everything from toasters to tractors. Daniel remembered the old man from childhood visits with his father, a quiet, meticulous worker who smelled of pipe tobacco and seemed to have a solution for every mechanical problem. By the time Daniel arrived, the auction was in full swing. The front lawn was dotted with numbered lots, furniture, dishware, garden tools, and boxes of miscellaneous household items. A small crowd of about 30 locals milled about, some serious buyers, others just there for the spectacle and free cookies provided by the church ladies. Daniel bypassed the household items and made a beeline for the workshop. Inside, tools and equipment were arranged in lots, each with a number and a clipboard for silent bids. Most of the quality power tools had already attracted multiple offers well beyond what Daniel could afford. His heart sank. "Not much left for the picking, is there?" said a voice behind him. Daniel turned to find Mary Keller, the local hardware store owner who'd been extending him credit for longer than he deserved. Her eyes held a mixture of pity and concern that made Daniel's pride sting. "Just browsing," he mumbled, pretending to examine a set of rusted chisels that weren't worth the paper they were listed on. "Well, don't overlook the corners," Mary advised, pointing to a shadowy area behind a workbench. "Herbert was old school. The real treasures might not be the shiniest things in the room." With a gentle pat on his arm, she moved on, leaving Daniel to contemplate the darker corners of the workshop. He made his way to the back, where the overhead light didn't quite reach. There, partially hidden beneath a tarp, sat a large metal toolbox, its red paint almost entirely consumed by rust. It looked like it had been forgotten for decades. Daniel lifted the auction tag, lot number 118. Vintage toolbox, contents included. The starting bid was marked at $5, with no other bids recorded. Daniel frowned. Even as scrap metal, it was worth that much. He tried the latches, but years of corrosion had sealed them tight. Through a small gap, he could see the shadowy outlines of wrenches and screwdrivers inside. Nothing spectacular, but tools he could use or sell individually if times got desperate enough. $5, he said aloud, pulling the cash from his wallet, one of his last few bills. He wrote his name on the empty bid sheet, wondering if this small act of hope was foolish or inspired. An hour later, as the auctioneer called the final lots, Daniel found himself the proud owner of a tetanus wrist disguised as a toolbox. The other auction-goers eyed it dubiously as he carried it to his truck, no one bothering to congratulate him on his win. That evening, as darkness fell and the rain continued to flow on Millfield, Daniel sat at his kitchen table with the rusted toolbox before him. His modest house, a small ranch-style home 3 blocks from the shop, had once belonged to his parents. Now, like everything else in his life, it teetered on the edge of foreclosure. With a flathead screwdriver and a hammer, he worked on the corroded latches, careful not to damage them beyond repair. The metal protested with ear-splitting squeaks until finally, with a satisfying crack, the first latch gave way. The second followed more easily. "Let's see what $5 buys these days," Daniel muttered to himself as he lifted the lid. The contents were unremarkable at first glance, standard tools from the 1960s or 70s, some with wooden handles worn smooth from years of use. He lifted them out one by one, wiping away grime and assessing their condition. Most were usable after a good cleaning, though worth little individually. As he removed the last wrench, something caught his eye. The felt lining at the bottom of the box seemed uneven, buckling slightly at one corner. Daniel ran his fingers along the edge, feeling a small gap. Curious, he pressed down, and to his surprise, the entire bottom panel shifted. "False bottom," he whispered, his heartbeat quickening. He'd heard of mechanics and handymen hiding valuables in their toolboxes, but had always dismissed it as urban legend. He carefully pried up the panel with his screwdriver. It came loose with surprising ease, as if it had been designed to be removed. Beneath it lay a space about 2 inches deep, perfectly concealed. And there they were, 3 items nestled in the secret compartment, preserved from time and elements, waiting for someone to discover them. Daniel's hands trembled slightly as he lifted out a gleaming gold pocket watch, surprisingly heavy and ornate. The cover was etched with intricate scrollwork, and when he opened it, the face revealed immaculate craftsmanship, the second hand still ticking steadily. Turning it over, he traced his finger over 3 engraved initials. EMC. Next came a yellowed, folded piece of paper. Daniel opened it carefully, revealing a hand-drawn map or blueprint. At the top, in elegant script, were the words, "Maplehurst Grounds." The map showed a large estate with gardens, outbuildings, and what appeared to be a small lake. The last item made his blood run cold. It was a photograph, edges worn soft with age, of a young woman in 1940s clothing, a simple dress with padded shoulders, her hair styled in victory rolls, her smile reserved but genuine as she stood beside a rose trellis. Daniel felt the air leave his lungs in a rush. He knew that face. He'd seen it 1,000 times in the single framed photograph his mother had kept hidden in her closet, the grandmother he'd barely known, who had died when he was only 4. "Eleanor," he whispered, his voice breaking on the name. Eleanor May Carter, his father's mother, a woman rarely discussed in their home, surrounded by whispers and unasked questions. And now, somehow, her photograph had found its way to him through a rusty toolbox purchased for $5 at a stranger's estate sale. But that wasn't all that sent a chill down his spine. The watch, EMC, Eleanor May Carter. It matched the description of a family heirloom his mother had once mentioned, supposedly stolen during a family argument, long before Daniel was born. Questions exploded in his mind like fireworks. Why was his grandmother's photograph and what appeared to be her personal effects hidden in Herbert Mercer's toolbox? What was Maplehurst, and why had he never heard of it? What connection did the old handyman have to his family? For the first time in months, Daniel forgot about the unpaid bills, the failing business, and the encroaching despair. Something more pressing consumed him now, a mystery that connected directly to his blood, his name, and perhaps even his future. He carefully gathered the items and placed them on the table, The rain outside forgotten as he stared at the face of the grandmother he barely remembered, wondering what secrets she had taken to her grave, and what truths this toolbox was about to reveal. Daniel couldn't sleep that night. The 3 items from the toolbox sat on his kitchen table under the harsh light of the overhead fixture: the gold pocket watch with EMC engraved on its back, the hand-drawn map of Maplehurst grounds, and the photograph of his grandmother Eleanor, a woman who existed in his memory only as a faint impression of flowery perfume and soft laughter. At dawn, he gave up on sleep and made a pot of coffee strong enough to strip paint. He pulled out the small wooden box from his closet, the only personal items he'd kept after his mother passed 3 years ago. Inside, nestled among his father's service medals and his mother's wedding ring, was the single framed photograph of Eleanor May Carter. Daniel placed it next to the newly discovered photo. There was no doubt, same high cheekbones, same slight tilt of the head. The woman in both images was unmistakably his grandmother, though in the toolbox photo she appeared younger, perhaps in her early 20s. He turned the gold pocket watch over in his hands. The craftsmanship was exquisite, not something a housemaid would likely own in the 1940s. When he pressed the latch, the cover sprang open to reveal an inscription inside. T. With love that transcends time. T.B. TB. Who was TB? And why did his grandmother have this watch? The memory surfaced like a bubble breaking the water's surface. He was 9 years old, sitting at this very table while his mother polished the silver, a ritual she performed despite their modest circumstances. "Mom had a beautiful gold watch once," she'd said, her voice distant. "It was stolen during a family argument before you were born. Her most treasured possession." Daniel had never questioned the story. Now, with the evidence literally in his hands, he wondered what other family secrets had been buried beneath convenient lies. He unfolded the map of Maplehurst grounds again. The property was enormous: a main house, gardens, a boathouse by a lake, servants' quarters, and a small chapel on a hill. Some areas were marked with small X's and numbers that made no sense to him. At the bottom corner, in tiny script: "Property of Thomas Blackridge, 1941. Thomas Blackridge. TB. Daniel's heart hammered against his ribs. He'd heard the name Blackridge before. They were old money, a family that had once owned half the county before selling off parcels during the economic downturns. Their names still adorned buildings downtown, including the library and the county courthouse. He pulled his laptop closer and typed, "Maplehurst Estate, Blackridge, Ohio," into the search bar. The first result was a historical society page describing Maplehurst as the crown jewel of Lake Erie's Gold Coast, home to the influential Blackridge family from 1888 until 1970. According to the brief description, the estate had fallen into disrepair after the death of the family patriarch, though portions of the grounds had been preserved as a historical site. Further down the search results was an obituary from 1943. Thomas Edward Blackridge, 26, heir to the Blackridge fortune, lost in tragic boating accident on Lake Erie. The article mentioned that Thomas was survived by his parents and younger sister, Elizabeth. Daniel sat back, mind racing. His grandmother had been born in 1920 according to the few family records he had. She would have been around 23 when Thomas Blackridge died. Had she worked at Maplehurst? Were she and Thomas involved somehow? And how did her personal effects end up hidden in Herbert Mercer's toolbox? He remembered Herbert vaguely, a quiet, stooped old man who kept to himself. Daniel had never heard his father mention any connection between Herbert and Eleanor. The map seemed to be the key. Daniel studied it more carefully, noticing that one of the X marks was positioned at what appeared to be the chapel. Another was near the boathouse, and a third at the edge of the formal garden. Was this some kind of treasure map? Had his grandmother hidden something at Maplehurst? One thing was certain: he needed to see this place for himself. Daniel showered and dressed quickly, tucking the photo, watch, and map carefully into his jacket pocket. The auto shop could wait. For the first time in months, he had a purpose that outweighed the daily grind of watching his father's business slowly fail. As he drove toward the county records office, His mind wandered to the family stories he'd grown up hearing. Eleanor had come to Millfield from up north. According to his father, no specifics, no family connections mentioned. She'd raised his father alone, working as a seamstress and house cleaner to make ends meet. His grandfather had died young, with no further explanation offered. What if the story he'd been told was only half true? What if his grandmother's life contained chapters that had been deliberately erased from family history? The gold watch weighed heavily in his pocket. T. With love that transcends time. T.B. Daniel gripped the steering wheel tighter. Whatever secrets Maplehurst held, he was determined to uncover them. Even if it meant excavating painful truths his family had buried long ago. For the first time in years, the mounting bills and failing business seemed distant and unimportant. In their place was something Daniel hadn't felt in a long time: hope, curiosity, and a driving need to understand who he really was, and where he came from. The county records office smelled of dust and aging paper. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Daniel explained his request to the clerk, a woman in her 60s with silver-rimmed glasses and a perpetual frown. Employment records for Maplehurst Estate? That's going back some. She eyed him suspiciously. Why the interest? Daniel hesitated. Family research. My grandmother might have worked there in the 1940s. Something in his expression must have softened her because she nodded. Wait here. 20 minutes later, she returned with a cardboard box labeled Maplehurst Estate, Personnel 1935 to 1950. She placed it on the table with surprising gentleness. Good luck, she said. These haven't been digitized yet. You've got until 5. Daniel thanked her and began sifting through employment records, payroll logs, and personnel files. Halfway through the second folder, he found it, a yellowed employee card with a small passport-style photo paperclip to the corner. Eleanor May Donovan. It read. Position housemaid. Employed May 15, 1939 to October 23, 1943. Donovan, her maiden name. The card listed her date of birth, previous employment, and a reference from a household in Cleveland. Daniel's hands trembled slightly. He'd found her. The dates aligned perfectly. Eleanor had left Maplehurst just a month after Thomas Blackridge's death. And according to Daniel's father's birth certificate, his father had been born in July 1944, 9 months after Eleanor left Maplehurst. The implication hit him like a physical blow. Could Thomas Blackridge have been his grandfather? Had Eleanor left Maplehurst pregnant with the heir to the Blackridge fortune? Daniel dug deeper, requesting additional files for the Blackridge family. Among tax records and property deeds, he discovered a thin folder labeled Legal Disputes, Unresolved. Inside was a document that made his heart race. Petition for recognition of inheritance rights on behalf of Eleanor May Donovan Carter. It was dated 1958, 15 years after Thomas's death, and filed by a law firm in Cleveland. The petition referenced a will that named any surviving blood relative of Eleanor May Donovan as beneficiary to a portion of the Blackridge estate. According to the document, this will had disappeared after the death of Samuel Blackridge, Thomas's father, when control of the estate passed to Thomas's mother, Vivian Blackridge. The petition had been dismissed due to insufficient evidence and the statute of limitations. Eleanor had tried to claim what was rightfully her child's, Daniel's father's, and failed. Another document caught his eye, a handwritten note attached to the case dismissal. Witness Herbert Mercer unavailable for testimony. Case closed by order of Judge William Blackridge, cousin to the deceased. Herbert Mercer. The man whose toolbox had started this whole journey. Daniel photographed every relevant document with his phone before returning the boxes. Outside, he sat in his truck, piecing together the story. Eleanor had worked as a housemaid at Maplehurst. She'd had a relationship with Thomas Blackridge. After his death, she left, pregnant and alone. Years later, she tried to claim her son's inheritance but was blocked by the powerful Blackridge family. And somehow, Herbert Mercer was connected. Daniel knew what he had to do next. He entered Maplehurst Estate, into his GPS and headed north. 40 minutes later, he pulled up to a rusted iron gate overgrown with ivy. Beyond it stretched a long, winding driveway leading to what had once been one of the grandest homes in northern Ohio. The estate had clearly seen better days. The main house stood in the distance, its once white facade now gray with age and neglect. A sign on the gate read, "Maplehurst Historical Trust, closed to public. Trespassers will be prosecuted." Daniel compared the actual grounds to the map from the toolbox. Much had changed over 80 years, but the basic layout remained recognizable. The main house, the now empty fountain in what had been formal gardens, and the small stone chapel on the hillside. As he contemplated his next move, an old pickup truck rumbled up the road. The driver, an elderly man in overalls, rolled down his window. "You lost?" he called. "Just looking," Daniel replied. "I think my grandmother worked here once." The man studied him for a long moment. "What's your name?" "Daniel Carter." Something flickered in the old man's eyes. "Carter? Eleanor's grandson?" Daniel's breath caught. "You knew my grandmother?" The man nodded slowly. "Name's Roy Jenkins. I was a groundskeeper here for 50 years, started when I was just 16. I knew Eleanor well." He unlocked the gate. "Come on in. There's things you should know." Daniel followed Roy's truck up the driveway, his pulse racing. As they parked near what had been the servants' quarters, Roy turned to him with an expression that was part wonder, part concern. "You look just like him, you know. Same eyes." "Like who?" "Thomas Blackridge." Roy's weathered face was solemn. "Your grandfather, if I'm not mistaken." Daniel's world tilted on its axis. The suspicion that had been forming since finding the toolbox was now confirmed by someone who had been there, who had known the truth all along. "What happened between them?" Daniel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Roy gazed toward the lake, visible through the trees. "A love story that ended in tragedy, and a family secret worth millions." He gestured toward the small chapel on the hill. "And it all started right up there, with a dropped handkerchief and a secret meeting that changed both their lives forever." Roy Jenkins's arthritic hands wrapped around a chipped coffee mug as they sat in what had once been the gardener's cottage. The small structure now served as the office for the skeleton crew that maintained what was left of Maplehurst. "Your grandmother was different from the other staff," Roy began. "Educated. Refined even. Her family lost everything in the Depression, and she took the position here because it paid better than factory work." Daniel nodded, hanging on every word about the grandmother he'd barely known. Thomas noticed her right away. He wasn't like the rest of the Blackridges, didn't care about social standing or what his mother thought. By 41, they were meeting in secret. The chapel was their spot. Roy gestured toward the stone building visible through the window. "Thomas gave her that watch the night before he shipped out to officer training. He'd enlisted despite his family's objections." "And the accident?" Daniel asked. Roy's eyes darkened. "Thomas came home on leave in October 43. The story was he took a boat out alone one night and drowned. His body washed up 3 days later." The old man paused. "But Herbert, he was the chauffeur and handyman then. Herbert saw something different that night." "What did he see?" "A fight between Thomas and his mother, Vivian. Thomas had just told her he intended to marry Eleanor, who by then was 3 months pregnant. Vivian was furious. Herbert drove Thomas to the boathouse that night on Thomas's orders. He was supposed to wait and then drive him to Eleanor's quarters. But Vivian showed up. Herbert stayed out of sight, but he heard the argument. When he peered around the boathouse, he saw Vivian leaving alone." Daniel felt a chill. "Are you saying?" "I'm not saying anything definite," Roy cut in. "But the next morning, Thomas was declared lost at sea, and Vivian ordered Eleanor off the property that same day. Paid her 6 months' wages to disappear." "And Herbert? Why did he hide these things in his toolbox?" "He was scared. After Thomas's will mysteriously vanished, the one leaving provisions for Eleanor and any child they might have, Herbert knew too much. He kept those items as insurance." If anything happened to him, someone might find them someday and put the pieces together. Daniel pulled out his phone and opened the photos he'd taken of the legal documents. My grandmother tried to claim her son's inheritance in 1958. The petition mentions Herbert as an unavailable witness. Roy nodded grimly. The Blackridges sent him to their property in Florida just before the hearing. By the time he returned, the case was closed. Judge was a Blackridge cousin. He shook his head. Old money protects its own. The current Blackridges, do they know about this? The main line died out years ago. The estate is managed by a trust now, but Thomas's sister Elizabeth's grandchildren control the family corporations from Chicago. The Blackridge Financial Group. Roy's expression hardened. They know the rumors. They've buried them for decades. Daniel pulled out his phone again and searched for Blackridge Financial Group. The company website appeared, featuring a sleek Chicago skyscraper and a photo of the executive team. The CEO, Margaret Blackridge Winters, bore a striking resemblance to the old photos of Vivian Blackridge, the same cold eyes and imperious tilt of the chin. I need to talk to them, Daniel said. Roy laughed bitterly. Good luck. People like us don't get past their receptionists. I have these. Daniel laid out the items from the toolbox. And I have DNA if it comes to that. Be careful, Roy warned. The Blackridges didn't get rich by playing fair. That evening, Daniel called the number listed on the Blackridge Financial Group website. After navigating an automated system, he finally reached a human assistant. I need to speak with Ms. Blackridge Winters regarding a family matter, he said. Ms. Blackridge Winters doesn't take unscheduled calls. The assistant replied coolly. Tell her it concerns Thomas Blackridge and Eleanor Carter. And a missing will. There was a long pause before the assistant asked him to hold. Moments later, a sharp female voice came on the line. This is Margaret Blackridge Winters. Who am I speaking with? Daniel took a deep breath. My name is Daniel Carter. I believe your great-uncle Thomas Blackridge was my grandfather. The silence that followed was brittle. Mr. Carter, these sorts of claims surface every few years. They're always baseless and often border on extortion. I have Thomas's watch, the one he gave Eleanor. I have a map of Maplehurst with markings that might indicate where the original will is hidden. And I have a witness who was present the night Thomas died. Another pause. Where are you calling from? Millfield. I'm at Maplehurst now. Stay there, she commanded. I'll have our attorney call you within the hour. The attorney, a man named Prescott with a voice like polished marble, offered to resolve the matter discreetly, with a one-time payment of $50,000 in exchange for the items and a non-disclosure agreement. Daniel declined. This isn't about money. It's about the truth. The truth, Mr. Carter, is subjective and often inconvenient. The Blackridge family has a legacy to protect. So do I, Daniel replied and ended the call. Roy had been listening nearby. They'll come for those items, he warned. They'll do anything to keep this quiet. Daniel studied the map of Maplehurst, focusing on the X marked at the chapel. Then we don't have much time. Herbert marked these spots for a reason. I think he hid copies of the will or other evidence. He pointed to the chapel. And I think we should start there. As twilight descended over Maplehurst, Daniel and Roy made their way up the hill to the stone chapel. The map in Daniel's hand seemed to pulse with potential, the final message from one ordinary man who'd witnessed extraordinary events, passed down through time in a $5 toolbox to someone who could finally bring the truth to light. The chapel stood silhouetted against the deepening twilight, its stone walls blackened with age and neglect. Stained glass windows, what remained of them, filtered the last rays of sunlight into kaleidoscope patterns on the dusty floor. Nobody's been in here for years, Roy said, fighting with the rusted lock. They were going to restore it, but the funding dried up. Daniel studied the map, comparing the X mark to their surroundings. It shows something beneath the altar. The lock finally gave way, and they stepped inside. Decades of dust muffled their footsteps as they approached the simple stone altar at the front. Daniel ran his hands along the worn edges, feeling for anything unusual. "Help me move it," he said. Together, they pushed the heavy altar a few inches to the right, revealing a loose flagstone beneath. Daniel pried it up with a pocket knife, uncovering a small cavity in the floor. Inside lay a metal box, similar to a safe deposit box but smaller, its surface pitted with corrosion. "Herbert's handiwork," Roy murmured. He knew every hiding place on this estate. The box wasn't locked. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had preserved it from moisture and time, was a manila envelope. Daniel opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a carbon copy of a handwritten will, Thomas Blackridge's true last testament, dated just before his death. The language was clear and unambiguous. "To Eleanor May Donovan and any children born of our union, I leave 30% of my personal estate and shares in Blackridge Industries, regardless of whether our marriage has taken place." Also inside was a letter from Thomas to Eleanor, never delivered, expressing his love and his determination to build a life with her despite his family's objections. Most damning of all was a handwritten account by Herbert Mercer, detailing what he'd witnessed the night Thomas died, Vivian Blackridge following her son to the boathouse, their heated argument, and her leaving alone. Herbert had been too afraid to come forward at the time, but had documented everything, including Vivian's later instructions to him to dispose of certain papers from Thomas's desk, papers Herbert had secretly preserved instead. "This is it," Daniel whispered. "This proves everything." Roy nodded gravely. "Question is, what will you do with it?" 2 days later, Daniel sat in the offices of James McConnell, a lawyer specializing in estate litigation. The elderly attorney reviewed the documents carefully, his expression growing increasingly intrigued. "The statute of limitations on the will contest expired decades ago," McConnell explained. "And proving wrongful death after 80 years would be virtually impossible." He tapped the papers thoughtfully. "But there's another angle here. The Maplehurst estate was placed in a historical trust in 1992. Part of that agreement included acknowledgement of the property's full historical significance." "Meaning what?" "Meaning that if the Blackridge Financial Group deliberately concealed significant historical facts about the property and its former owners, which these documents suggest they did, they could be in breach of the trust agreement." McConnell smiled. "It's not about inheritance anymore. It's about truth and public record." A week later, Daniel found himself in a conference room in Chicago, facing Margaret Blackridge Winters across a polished table. Her attorney, Prescott, sat beside her, while McConnell accompanied Daniel. "These accusations are preposterous," Prescott began. "Even if these documents were authentic, which we don't concede, they're irrelevant after all this time." McConnell laid out their position calmly. "We're not seeking control of Blackridge Financial Group or even a significant financial settlement. Mr. Carter wants 3 things: public acknowledgement of Thomas and Eleanor's relationship, recognition of his legitimate connection to the Blackridge family, and placement of a memorial at Maplehurst honoring both Thomas and Eleanor." Margaret's perfectly composed face betrayed a flicker of surprise. "That's all?" "With one addition," Daniel said, speaking directly to her. "A modest endowment to establish a vocational training program for underprivileged youth in Millfield. I think Thomas would have wanted that." "And if we refuse?" Prescott asked. McConnell produced copies of letters they'd sent to major newspapers and historical societies detailing the Blackridge family's decades-long concealment of historical facts. "These go public tomorrow unless we reach an agreement today." Margaret studied Daniel with new interest. "You're not what I expected, Mr. Carter." "What did you expect?" "Someone looking for a payout. Someone less Blackridge." Her lips curved in a reluctant smile. "You have his eyes, you know. Thomas's eyes. My grandmother, Elizabeth, had the same ones." The settlement was reached within hours. The Blackridge Financial Group would fund the Eleanor May Workshop, a training facility for underprivileged youth interested in automotive and mechanical trades. Maplehurst would include an exhibit on Thomas and Eleanor's relationship in its historical records. And Daniel would receive a modest but comfortable settlement, enough to save his shop and secure his future. As they signed the papers, Margaret pulled a small box from her purse. Elizabeth saved this. She always believed her brother's death wasn't an accident, but she was too young to challenge their mother. Inside was a matching pocket watch to the one Daniel had found, this one with TB engraved on the back. He bought a pair. I think he'd want you to have both. 1 month later, Daniel stood in the freshly renovated garage of Carter's Auto Repair, now expanded to include the Eleanor May workshop. The first class of students, 6 teenagers from Millfield with aptitude but few opportunities, watched attentively as he demonstrated how to rebuild a carburetor. On the wall hung a framed photograph of Eleanor and Thomas, smiling from across time, flanked by the 2 gold watches that had finally found their way back together, symbols of a love that had endured despite every effort to erase it. For the first time in years, Daniel felt the weight of legacy not as a burden, but as a foundation. His grandmother had faced impossible odds with quiet dignity. Her son, his father, had built a business with nothing but hard work and determination. And now Daniel would carry that legacy forward, enriched by the truth that had been hidden in a $5 toolbox, waiting for the right person to uncover it. 1 year had passed since the rusty toolbox had changed everything. The Eleanor May workshop was thriving, with a waiting list of students eager to learn. Carter's Auto Repair had been modernized but maintained its character, a delicate balance of honoring tradition while embracing the future. On this particular morning, Daniel arrived early. The workshop wouldn't open for another hour, but he enjoyed these quiet moments alone with his thoughts and the echoing presence of those who had come before him. The autumn sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Daniel moved through the space, checking equipment and preparing for the day's lessons. His steps led him, as they always did, to the far corner of the workshop. There, untouched since the day of its revelation, sat the rusty red toolbox. Daniel had never returned it to use, instead leaving it as a monument to fate and fortune. In the years since finding it, he'd learned to appreciate how thin the line between coincidence and destiny could be. If he hadn't gone to that auction, if he hadn't noticed the toolbox in the shadows, if he hadn't investigated the false bottom, how different his life would be. Above the toolbox hung a custom-built display case. Behind the glass, Eleanor's photograph was centered, flanked by the 2 gold pocket watches, eternal timepieces that had outlasted their owners but preserved their story. Below them was the map of Maplehurst, now accompanied by Herbert Mercer's written testimony and a copy of the settlement with the Blackridge Financial Group. A small brass plaque at the bottom of the display read, "Hidden truths never stay buried. For Eleanor." Daniel ran his fingers lightly over the plaque, feeling the raised letters beneath his touch. The words had come to him in a dream shortly after the settlement, and they seemed to encapsulate everything this journey had taught him. The quarterly check from the Blackridge Endowment had arrived yesterday, enough to fund operations and scholarships for another 3 months. But more valuable than the money had been the connections formed. 3 of Daniel's graduates had secured positions at prestigious automotive companies. Another 2 had started their own mobile repair service. The latest class included the great-granddaughter of Herbert Mercer, a coincidence that felt ordained by something larger than chance. Daniel's relationship with the Blackridge family had evolved in unexpected ways as well. Margaret had visited the workshop twice, bringing her teenage son who showed surprising aptitude for mechanical work. The family resemblance had been unmistakable, the same eyes that looked back at Daniel from his own mirror each morning. The legal mediation had expanded into something more meaningful, reconciliation. Not the erasing of past wrongs, but an acknowledgement of them and a commitment to build something better in their place. The shop bell chimed as the front door opened. "You're here early," came Roy's voice. The old groundskeeper had become a fixture at the workshop, sharing his knowledge of tools and machinery with the students and his memories of Maplehurst with Daniel. "Just thinking," Daniel replied. Roy nodded toward the toolbox. "Ever wonder what Herbert would think of all this?" Daniel considered the question. "I think he'd be pleased. He held on to those secrets for decades, making sure they'd find their way to the right person at the right time. The longer I live, the less I believe in coincidence," Roy said, easing himself onto a nearby stool. His health had declined in recent months, but his mind remained sharp as ever. Herbert used to say everything happens in its proper season. Daniel had discovered over the past year that Roy and Herbert had been close friends, unlikely allies in a world where people in their positions were expected to remain invisible. Together they'd preserve the truth, one guarding evidence in a hidden compartment, the other keeping memories alive until someone came looking for answers. "Next month's the anniversary of Thomas and Eleanor's first meeting," Roy said. "The Maplehurst Historical Exhibit opens that same day." Daniel nodded. "I'll be there." The sound of cars pulling into the parking lot signaled the arrival of the day's students. Daniel moved to prepare for their lesson, but paused at the toolbox one last time. In the years since its discovery, he'd learned that value rarely resided where people expected to find it. Not in the tools themselves, which had been ordinary, but in the secret compartment beneath them. Not in the gold of the watches, but in the story they told. Not in the Blackridge fortune, but in the knowledge of where he came from and who he was meant to be. Daniel picked up a wrench from his workbench. Soon the shop would be filled with voices and the sounds of work, the next generation learning to fix what was broken, to find value in what others discarded, to see potential where others saw only rust. He gazed at Eleanor's photograph one more time. She'd faced her challenges with dignity and perseverance, qualities that had been passed down through the generations even when her story had not. Now her legacy would continue, not just through blood but through the lives touched by the workshop that bore her name. The front door opened again as the first students arrived, their voices bright with possibility. "Ready to get started?" Daniel called to them, turning away from the past and toward the future it had made possible. The rusty toolbox sat silent in its corner, its purpose fulfilled, its secret revealed, its journey complete. What had begun with a desperate $5 purchase had blossomed into something priceless: identity, closure, and a legacy to live up to. And that, Daniel thought as he welcomed his students, was worth more than all the Blackridge fortune could ever buy.